Alright gang, in this video we're going to look at an example in which we analyze a study scenario and write down the null and alternative hypothesis, and also consider what the conclusions would potentially look like here. In 2016, the proportion of Tanzanian cheetahs surviving their first year of life was determined to be 20%. A researcher suspects this value has decreased. Let's write the null and alternative hypothesis. We're going to use the notation here. H0 for the null, H1 for the alternative. Sometimes remember that is written as HA, so I'm going to put HA here as a option. The proportion is the parameter that is being investigated. So the parameter of interest here is the proportion. So we're going to write that into our hypothesis with the letter P. P for proportion. The null hypothesis always has an equal sign. A value needs to be written after that equal sign. The choice for that value is going to be this 20%, because that's the baseline value that we're going to compare to. So I'm going to write 0.2. That same number gets written for the null and for the alternative hypothesis. Now let's consider if the alternative hypothesis will be a left-tailed, right-tailed, or two-tailed. A researcher suspects that this proportion has decreased. Because that says decreased, we're going to write a less than sign. So this is a left-tailed alternative hypothesis. Left-tailed. So that's all there is to it. But let's do another example. I'm going to just slightly modify what we just had. Let's rewrite what we just wrote for the null and alternative hypothesis if the researcher thinks that this value has changed. So I'm going to rewrite everything here that is in light blue, and all of that light blue components are going to stay the same, because 20%, 0.2, that was the baseline value, the proportion of surviving cheetahs from a few years ago. But because the researcher in this scenario thinks that that proportion has changed, that is implying that we use a two-tailed or a non-directional alternative hypothesis. So it's not necessarily that they have an inkling or they've seen some evidence that suggests a decrease or an increase. They're just looking if a change has occurred. So we're going to use a not equal to symbol there. And that's it. Next, I would like us to state some conclusions based on these scenarios. And I'm going to call this scenario number 1, and we'll call this scenario number 2. Because of the way the hypothesis is stated, we would state our conclusion in a slightly different way. Okay, let's state a conclusion as if we were to reject the null hypothesis from scenario number 1. When we are looking at this scenario, the null hypothesis is that baseline. That's that 20% first-year survival. But because we are going to reject that null hypothesis based on the sample data, that means that there is evidence for the alternative hypothesis based on that sample data. So I want to state that there is evidence for the alternative, but I want to translate this statement in everyday terminology so that way it doesn't take a statistician to understand it. I might write something to the extent of there is evidence to support that the proportion of what? The proportion of cheetahs that survive their first year has decreased or is now less than 20%. So there is evidence to support the proportion of cheetahs surviving their first year has decreased from 20%. And that's it. That's just a translation of what it means to reject the null hypothesis. That indicates that the sample data provided evidence to suggest or support that the proportion has decreased from that stated value. When I write these conclusions, I like to mention the parameter. In this case, the parameter was the proportion P. I like to mention the random variable, which was the survival rate. And I also like to mention the value that was used. So the value here was the 20%. I think stating whether your evidence supports or does not support a particular hypothesis, and if you state all these elements, it really ties it all together. Let's practice stating another conclusion, this time from scenario number 2, but again, we will practice the way we state this when we reject the null hypothesis. When a rejection of the null hypothesis occurs, there is still, we're saying that there's evidence for the alternative. But this is going to look a little different from what we previously wrote, because in scenario number 2, we weren't looking for a decrease. These researchers were investigating if there was a change. So to state the conclusion here, it would look very similar, except instead of the word decreased, I'm going to write the word change. Otherwise, I can leave all the other elements in place. There's evidence to support the alternative hypothesis, which states that the proportion has changed, it's not equal, from 20%. We're going to run through this exercise one more time, in which we are practicing stating a conclusion, but this time it's going to be when we do not reject the null hypothesis. When we do not reject the null hypothesis, that's an indication that the sample data does not support the alternative hypothesis. So when we write that, I would say a lot of the similar wording that we wrote earlier, but this time I would state that there is not sufficient evidence to support that the proportion of surviving cheetahs has decreased. Let's look at the elements here that I've included. I mentioned the parameter, which was the proportion again. I mentioned the variable, which was that first year survival, and I've mentioned that value, which was decreased from 20%. But this time, because we are not rejecting the null hypothesis, we do not have evidence for that decrease. You can benefit from your previous work if you've already thought about what a rejection sounds like. Because notice in this first sentence here, the only thing that has changed was I put the word not. There is not sufficient evidence to support that decrease. So I think that will conclude this video. And in the next video, we're going to look at another component of hypothesis testing in which an error could be made. We will discuss those possible errors and then discuss the impact of those errors as applied to this cheetah example.